in a sense, we've had a sort of small go at trying to link adjustment in trade agreements with sort of World Trade Routine and trade agreements at the same time. I think that's clearly not been enough. It's been inadequate. Is that a model that can be built upon going forward when you pile more onto that sort of process of getting an actual trade agreement through Congress to make a conditional and much more substantial set of policy reforms, or is the system just not up to that, and we're going to not get the trade outcomes, we're not going to get the policy outcomes that we need at the same time moving forward?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to recognize, and Jay and I were talking about this before, and Jay mentioned it, that TAA, the Trade Adjustment Assistance, is woefully inadequate, and not only that, it isn't taken up. I mean, it's not used by people who might qualify for it. I think that I would agree with Jay's point, which is this is not really about adjustment to trade. It's about adjustment or social, political, and economic adjustment generally. So you can't solve the problem of the American labor markets or of workers in the American labor market simply by focusing on those who can prove that they've been displaced by imports in a particular product or from a particular country, because the effects are transmitted throughout the economy in a way that isn't limited just to those who are directly impacted by trade. So I think the broader way of addressing this, and probably also, well, I hesitate to say this, the more politically feasible way, is to address the broader problems of workers in the American labor market, rather than saying we're going to target those who are affected by China trade or by trade more generally. I think there is a broad recognition that in particular, and you made this reference, in particular mid-career workers are having a great deal of difficulty adjusting to technological and more broadly economic change. Whether there was a recent study at the New York Fed about the declining interstate mobility of American workers, much of which is in this 45 to 60 year age bracket. People are 50 years old, they lose their job, they know that there are jobs elsewhere, but leaving their home and trying to relocate is extraordinarily difficult. So the reduced mobility of American workers, the reduced inter-industry mobility of American workers is part of the core of the problem, and addressing that is more politically palatable and more politically attainable in trying to address specific trade measures themselves. That's a tall order because it involves setting up a set of social safety nets that we don't have now, or expanding some of the ones that we have, and probably a fiscal impact as well. But I think the sense that some of the current furor over trade and over other issues that have taken on this populist character may give policymakers some of the incentives to respond to the social dislocations that have given rise to this populist sentiment. So I would see it in a broader social context rather than purely on the trade front.
I mean, I want to juxtapose a little some of the themes of your presentation and yours. I thought we both made very that same point. It's clearly important to broaden the lens of globalization and trade. There's tax, there's immigration, there's capital markets, and there's a lot of key dimensions there, which a lot of actors have roles to lead, certainly businesses and civil society and governments as well. You've got a very specific view that we've sort of run out of steam, at least when it comes to government-led trade agreements. And so a couple of things spring to mind when we think about that. One is, do you see this also when you think about government-led issues in other spaces of globalization, like tax and investment and the like? So do you see it as a broad-based sort of government capacity problem across all these agendas, or just trade? And how much of it is, you talk about how, going to USTR and promise is no longer a solution it was in the past. How much of this is a product of dysfunction in Washington? How much of it you talk about changes globally that has limited the capacity of the US to get its way, essentially, and that might have been easy to do 10 or 15 years ago? And finally, so let's also bring you in on that, because your view, I think, to some extent, of ways forward is something that GE could run, but how do SMEs work in this type of work?
So look, I think the general feeling among corporate leaders, and certainly within the business environment, is that governments just are not working effectively. That there is just largely dysfunction in many governments around the world, not all, but many. And certainly Washington has proven to be ineffective in dealing with significant challenges that we face as a country, that there's crying need for addressing a variety of problems been clear for a decade, and there just simply hasn't been significant action on them. So I think, so that's a bit of an answer to your question. As to what is the role of government in these other spaces, and for that matter in trade as well. Look, I'm not suggesting that governments have no role in these areas. Clearly they do. Take financial market regulation, which I think is quite important, at least in terms of creating the financing that is necessary for trade to continue to happen, when trading goods or other things. But I guess my mindset with respect to the role of governments going forward is first do no harm, right? Before, my goal had been that governments lead the charge, right? And that really was the era that Jeff referred to, of government-driven, breaking down of global barriers. And maybe it's simply been sufficiently successful in the trade in goods area that now all we need to do is protect what exists. In my heart, I believe there is more that could be done there. I think TPP would be helpful in doing more. But I guess my point is, in this era, that may be too much to ask for. And so largely what I want governments to do is step back, to the extent you're going to regulate, do so in as streamlined and efficient fashion as possible, be as transparent as possible, set rules for the road, and let companies and data flows and other things take the lead and carry the banner, the sort of baton of globalization forward from here, at least for some period of time.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. What role do governments play in this new era? I agree that it's just as a personal note, it seems unlikely that we're going to see multilateral or even major bilateral new trade agreements. But in a way, everything in our research says, well, that matters less and less. That actually, when you look at there's econometric results that I mentioned about how openness contributes to GDP growth. Well, cross-border data flows now account for as much of the impact and actually slightly more than trading goods. So it is a different era, and in the digital era, governments, they need to set the foundation, make sure we don't have adverse requirements like data localization. Cybersecurity is incredibly important across all nations, and that's a corporate imperative, but it's also a government imperative, and there could be more platforms for sharing. And then there's other sort of rules of the road type regulation that are important. So one of the really important things that the WTO has achieved is TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, to harmonize customs procedures. So if you're going to have small businesses doing small shipments of stuff that goes through customs, reducing costs, digitizing customs, streamlining that becomes incredibly important. So governments do have a role. But I agree with Corinne that I think it's more of a setting the stage for business to carry on, businesses large and businesses that are small, and even entrepreneurs in this new era. And I think I'd also say, look, we have to work on all fronts. For those of us, presumably everyone in this room is here because we do believe in openness and trade. So preaching to the choir, let's work on all fronts. Let's try to get TPP passed, and let's work on combating the micro-protectionist legislation that's occurring around the world, whether it's more people in government doing that, along with more people in GE and other companies doing that. I mean, let's operate on all fronts, but I completely agree that the new era is less about governments. If you take an even longer historical view to think about how globalization has worked, if you go back to the age of explorers, that was literally governments. That was kings and queens sending explorers out from Europe to discover the new world. And even the British East Indies Company, right, a government conglomerate. Then we moved into the era where it was large multinational corporations. And I think that the next era is not even necessarily large multinational corporations. It's small businesses, entrepreneurs, it's individuals driving globalization forward.
So I'm going to strike perhaps a discordant note. There's no question that around the world, in almost every country, faith in government, confidence in government, is at a extraordinarily low end, lower than we've seen in the post-war period, whether it's in Europe and North America and many of the emerging markets. That's true of the business sector, that's true of popular sentiment more generally. So there is a very widespread perception that governments aren't getting the job done. But I think I will guarantee you, I think I can guarantee you that if business and other political actors withdraw from the political arena, that vacuum will be filled almost immediately by the kinds of populists that we've seen both in the emerging markets in Europe and in North America. I mean, this is not a flash in the pan. This is a broad-based movement already running governments in Central and Eastern Europe, already running governments throughout the emerging markets, and with substantial support in most developed countries, as we have seen in this election. So withdrawing from the political arena means surrendering it, perhaps, to people who do not want to maintain the current level of openness. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I would say is, I don't necessarily disagree with the notion that, it's clearly the case that peer-to-peer and people-to-people and firm-to-firm relations are extraordinarily important. But let's not forget that in the final analysis and at the end of the road, governments can control just about anything they want to if they set their minds to it. Look at the way that sanctions regimes have been imposed when they've been attempted. Right? So if you want to design disaster scenarios, they're not hard to design. It's not hard to think about ways that governments could take things in a very, very different direction than they've been going. So simply withdrawing and allowing inertia to move things forward in the private sector, I think, is not a winning strategy. It's not a strategy.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree with either one. As I said, I think there's going to be growing risk of sanctions and of bad things happening, point one. And two, I think that is one of the areas that the private sector or thought leaders need to be engaged on. I guess I go back to first, do no harm, right? I think much of our at least the Washington community's time in the next few years is going to have to be spent preventing further bad legislation or bad regulatory and policy initiatives, not driving forward a lot of what I'd ideally like to see, sort of good new pro-globalization, pro-trade initiatives.
But driving back bad policy initiatives is not simply a matter of education, because in many instances, there are underlying interests at stake. So a lot of the people who are supporting these populist measures probably have been hurt by trade or have been hurt by immigration. And so education in and of itself, listen, I'm not against education. I've spent 25 years in the field, so I'm all in favor of even more education for everyone. But educating people as to the desirability of an open world economy is not how we're going to how we're going to protect that open world economy. It's actually addressing the, I think, legitimate concerns of people about the fact that their jobs are less secure, their lives are less secure, their environment is less secure.
But I would have to say there's also a narrative piece. I mean, yes, let's address those that have been hurt. I mean, I think that the IMF actually really had it right this time, making globalization work for everyone and making technology work for everyone. But I look around Washington, and many of you work at think tanks, like where's the new think tank to create that new narrative? Because in addition to addressing the needs of workers who have been displaced, we need to create a new conversation, a different conversation, and the champions laying out a new narrative of how openness is good and beneficial to everyone have been lost amid the backlash of populism. And certainly there are folks around town trying to do that, but I would love to see a new centrist, new narrative, a new social marketing campaign, if you will, in defense of an open world economy.
The other thing, Jeffrey, I just sort of pointed out, like, I don't disagree that we're going to perpetually or for a long term be in a period of the sort of populist lurches if we don't deal with some of our fundamental competitiveness problems. But I also am not sure that simply rejiggering some of these government programs is going to be the way to get it. I will tell you that, from our vantage point, the internal training, job skilling, and so forth that we do as a company as we go through some period of change in the economy and the country is far better, far more effective than what I've seen any government program do. And I suspect that a lot of my colleagues out there will say the same thing about their programs. So again, I just sort of get back to we do need to have solutions for this, but it's not clear to me that the government is going to be the solution provider.
Great. Quickly, like for please introduce yourself. Question as well.
Hi, Bob Vastine, Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. Okay, I grew up in a coal town in Pennsylvania, population 20,000 in 1945, about 5,000 now. Had nothing to do with trade. That's my point. Schott and Kenny Griswold have estimated maybe unemployment due to trade is about 3%. The issue is thus, I support everything you've been saying about the causes of unhappiness, dislocation. The issue is what to do about it, and a number of citizens support a number of ideas. And those ideas have been floating around, like wage insurance and other ideas to assistance in mobility. Karan, it's going to take the president, it's going to take government leadership to frame the program. The business community to whom we've looked, the Roundtable, the Chamber, others, have not come forward with a comprehensive, if there is a comprehensive, a thought-through agenda of measures that could be taken to help the broadly dislocated people, dislocated communities. So if the president, the administration doesn't do it, who's going to do it? I've heard you, I've heard Chris Billa say, look, the corporate sector is doing way more than share, way more effectively, because they can identify the job needs, they can train to need, which has always been the problem. Labor Department says they trained 46,000 individuals last year. Whether that was effective or not, who knows? But it's too fashionable to trash GAA. We have to do more with that and with a lot of other programs such as you've all mentioned, but I think it's just got to take top-level leadership.
So I would be the last person to argue against strong presidential leadership in addressing any of these issues. I would be delighted to see it. I would be delighted to see strong congressional congressional leadership. But I'm not making the case that if that existed and could drive through an effective program that would supplement what companies were doing in this area, it wouldn't be an optimal outcome. All of those points I will concede. I am skeptical with the two presidential candidates we've got right now that we are going to see a strong pro-trade agenda, that we have this as a piece of it. I'm skeptical that even if you did, that you would have political consensus in this city to be able to enact anything. And the absence of that, I'm saying, let's if we can get it, great. If we can't, we still have to go forward. And companies like ours, big companies, need to probably stand up and take an even greater leadership role in terms of helping prepare this country for the dynamic period that it is going through and is going to continue to go through. So I don't necessarily think we have a disagreement there. I'd love to see it. I'm just not holding my breath.
John?
John Barrow, Covington. Question, but first I want to give a shout out to Jeff. More than a decade ago, about a decade ago, he wrote a terrific book, Global Capitalism, which ended with a cautionary chapter that we shouldn't take for granted political support for globalization, which at the time was a different note. It was a time when Tom Friedman, the world was flat. This is all on autopilot, so your book was terrific and prescient. My question regards, Susan, your term is a great term, micro-protectionism. I want to bring you and welcome Karan's response as well. Is in that environment, right now, the USTR's tools are get on a plane, go to country X, pound on the table and say, for your own sake, you should do this, or go to Geneva and file a WTO case. And there's not a lot of tools in between to address micro protections. And I'd welcome any thoughts you might have about A, whether you agree with that assessment, and B, what we do about it.
I would agree with your assessment. I think it's very, I think you've hit the nail on the head. And we heard Jay earlier say they need more bodies. If you want to actually launch into a negotiation bilaterally with a country or bring a case to the WTO, you need people at your disposal to pick up over that small issue. And the proliferation of these small issues makes it very difficult to combat with a government. That's got a set number of people without expanding it significantly. So part of it is manpower. But I think that part of it is also taking a note from what Corinne has been talking about, which is a private sector fighting in its own interest. And it's not just discussions, so let's just look at some of the EU going after Apple, Google, some of the giant US tech companies. Part of it can be government to government, but part of it is the private sector negotiating with regulators abroad, but also trying to build popular support. I mean, let's take a tactic from politics and government, building grassroots support to illustrate here would be the consequences of these types of measures going through. And I think the example of Brazil is a good one. That at the end of the day, countries will act in their own self-interest, but it takes a lot of work. It takes work on all fronts at all levels to actually get that common understanding. So it's the WTO was complex. The Doha round went on for years and years and was complex. But this new world, I think, is even more complex because it's a lot of grassroots, one-on-one discussions at all levels, from top government to government, business to government, and even just public sentiment to combat. It's complicated.
John, I first of all, it's a topic that I've given some thought to. I know you have as well, and I've written pieces on this subject of things that can be done to sort of strengthen our trade enforcement efforts. I think it's a topic we're thinking about, but I will say at the end of the day, a couple of things make me skeptical that even if we could come up with something here that would have any impact, right? One is the relative power of the United States, at least with respect to some of these large trading partners, is not what it was a generation ago, number one. I think point two is the multiplicity of these things. I mean, there are simply so many, right? I think the only truly systemic way to sort of get at these kinds of things will be A, for the markets to disappoint, and I think that's what you do see happening in some places. And B, to have an agenda globally for growth that sort of gets people off of the back foot. I mean, the reality is we've seen these things flourish, particularly in the post-global financial crisis period, when the world has been sort of desperate and hungry for a growth agenda. And short of, the beggar thy neighbor monetary policies that we've seen occur, just hasn't been out there. Some of this goes to what Bob was talking about in terms of leadership. I mean, if in the absence of that sort of strong leadership and growth, there are very few problems in the world that can't be addressed by stronger growth. But in the absence of a growth agenda, you're going to continue to see these sort of protectionist things, because it's the natural inclination of any government that's sort of saying, God, we're looking at a slow growth environment, and I got to capture a little bit greater share of that pie. And so you can look into great things that the USTR could have, but I'm not convinced that at the end of the day that's the solution to this systemic problem.
Hi, Tanya Cook with Amway Corporation. Populist views, but you haven't really delved into the impact that social media is having on companies. Companies are seen as the bad guys, and yet there's so much inaccurate information being posted, and politicians are creating laws based on these bad facts that are floating around, and then they go global very quickly.
think it's an interesting point. I think that while you have some anti-government sentiment, maybe on the far left of the political spectrum, there is a real anti-corporate, anti-establishment. The business titans, inequality among segments, and all of that, of course, is fueled by social media. I don't know what the solution is, though, other than, to adapt to it, to get out there and be part of it. I don't think that there's a way of turning back the clock on how we communicate with each other, which is electronically all the time in 140 characters.
So just very quickly, we ran some experiments in different markets around language around trade to see what worked and what didn't. So we set up sites on Facebook and so forth. And what was interesting, this is not going to surprise you, anything that used the word trade, pull further about it. What was interesting from our perspective was the narratives that really worked with people were very local narratives around pride in their community. So I remember one of these was around Houston. It was done in Houston. And it was really around Houston and the Port of Houston connecting the city to the global environment. And that sort of tying globalization to pride in your local community was something that actually did play. So look, I think obviously there's more, in this space as we try to continue to sort of push this boulder uphill, they're getting a handle on how to communicate more effectively in that space. Goodness knows we could all use all that.
Joe DeMond with Bio. I was struck by something you said about what your CEO said about how your company, and I see some other companies do, basically have a choice but to respond to government policies, incentives like localization policies, and at the same time, or the ideal policy would be governments just do no harm. But it seems that there's a kind of a dilemma here. The more that companies react, we do see companies reacting out of self-interest. Kind of gives the impression that these policies work or they're effective because you can let people land big fish by having a localization policy. Maybe just encourage other countries to do the same thing. And B, it does cause a backlash here. Both candidates are talking about companies, not necessarily yours, as being better than government companies by going abroad and everything. So inadvertently, you're kind of, it's this behavior by the companies, which is economically rational, I get it, kind of contributing to the very government policies that you don't see.
So I guess I have a couple of things. First of all, just to be clear, while we have done this, we have not reduced our industrial employment in the United States. We have basically used the U.S. as the basis for our highest technology manufacturing and innovation and design and all of that, which goes in to support our exports around the world. So, from my vantage point, this is ultimately, yes, you may be doing this, you are basing production in a country abroad, in part because of this mandatory localization requirement. It doesn't necessarily directly cut against the United States, at least in terms of growth. Now, I'll come back to your point about maybe it should, right? Maybe that should be, maybe it would be helpful to sort of gin people up, but simply as a factual matter, I sort of make that point. I think the second thing I would say is it's the nature of globalization that we are going to see going forward is one where markets are going to contribute to a large company in a way. There's going to be more specialization in terms of how products get put together and services get put together in any event, even in the absence of this. So again, just a point of clarification there that you've sort of seen this happen sort of writ large. Having said all that, yeah, look, I'm not sort of I think this is unfortunately, I don't know what the game theory term is for it, but it's a situation where each individual company is responding to these market forces in ways that make absolute sense for the company itself, right? To comply with the local requirements because that's what you need to do and able to compete. In aggregate, it doesn't make sense. Now, you do see these countries over time, I think, recognizing that their policies are suboptimal. I mean, you go through some historical examples about, Argentina and its efforts to force localization of computer manufacturing, and it's proven to be a huge bust and a huge cost to the economy, and they backed away. But I fear we're in another one of those cycles. We're in a cycle of sort of strong import substitution-led sets of policies, strong localization sets of policies, and it may take time, and it may take the free market sort of ultimately sort of proving to them that those don't work for them to back off of it. So I don't have a clear solution. I think it is out there as a problem.
Yeah.
Rocky Gibson with American Auto Policy Council. There's been a lot of discussion about the U.S. possibly withdrawing from the global economy and how trade is taking a beating over the last couple of years. How much of that would you say is about TPP? Obviously, a lot of the TPP countries we have a long tortured history with trade with those countries. How much of that is actual trade? I think it's pretty easy to envision the Clinton administration making a strong push on TTIP. Labor is very least given a lot of space on TTIP. Whereas TPP has become this very hot button issue over the last couple of years. So my question is how much of this is actually about trade, or how much of this is actually about TPP?
Well, if you're talking about at the level of public opinion, I think we have a pretty clear sense that TPP symbolizes trade, trade symbolizes globalization, and globalization symbolizes rapid and undesirable changes in the structure of the American labor market, the structure of the American economy. People make that connection, right? They connect the bottom falling out of the lower end of the labor market with globalization and therefore with trade, and sort of the rise of a headquarters society where the top 10% do well with globalization. And, there is no necessary connection between TPP per se and globalization, but in the popular mind there is. So I think the opposition to TPP, the popular opposition to TPP is not specifically about the characteristics of the agreement itself, but about what it symbolizes.
I definitely agree with that, but the question was the U.S. withdrawing from the global economy. I think it's very easy to envision the Clinton administration saying, like, look, in fact, John Podesta said this a Politico, it's not worth the political capital. But I think it is easy to envision the Clinton administration making a big push on TTIP, a trade agreement with the EU. So it's not necessarily that we're withdrawing from the global economy, it's just TPP.
So those are a number of different points of view, points, and I'm not quite sure which one you want to focus on. The opposition to, or the concern about the insecurity associated with globalization is going to continue, and it's going to affect TTIP and it's going to affect TPP. There's no question about that. Then you have the more specific characteristics of these agreements, which is largely about the firms and industries and groups that are directly affected. And there you've got the pulling and hauling that you all know about in Washington. But I think you cannot ignore, trade has typically been about concentrated interests on either side of the issue. There are times, rare times actually, historically, when trade becomes a hot button issue for the mass public. And we're in one of those times. And so whether it's TPP or TTIP, you have to confront the fact that the mass public has a very strong bias against further trade agreements. And that doesn't mean they're doomed, because there was a strong bias against NAFTA in the mass public, and it went through. But it means that the struggle is going to be extremely difficult, and will, I think, have to confront the broad political realities that we're seeing in this presidential campaign.
I would just add the point that not doing anything is in itself doing something. You've either got to be running for trade and globalization and openness, or by de facto, micro-protectionisms are happening. So I think it's false to think, well, we just won't spend the political capital and sit tight for 4 years. That is a decision, and that means it's like barnacles on a ship. These like little micro-protectionist things that come up. You've got to continually take care of your boat and scrape those barnacles off, or else you can't wait 4 years and let them accumulate and then say, okay, then we'll fight for it. It's like then you've already taken a big step backward. So
But so technically it gets passed and I'm done. I think we've got one more gentleman with that.
Bill Frymore, Stewart. I just want to ask a question that hopefully ends this on an optimistic note. Very interesting discussion. I appreciate the need to look at other issues, encouraging us as a trade community to look at other issues, to, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's worker training. I would also add innovation policy and IP policy. The nexus between strong innovation IP policy and trade policy is sort of the future. The countries that are competitive in this arena are the ones that are most competitive. My question is for Susan and anyone else. Where are the success stories in the world, either amongst developing or developed countries, where they've been able to make that transition to a strong innovation infrastructure, good domestic policies melded with globalization and positive outlook to the world?
Well, I would say look around. I mean, this is the strongest economy in the world for innovation. I'll just say it. It is. Now, infrastructure, not so much. But innovation, we have going in spades. And we've been open. And we've been open to immigrants who are more likely than native-born people to start businesses of all kinds, not only in Silicon Valley, but just your dry cleaner, your restaurant, whatever, small business. So I think the U.S. has actually been incredibly successful at innovation and remains successful. There are, other smaller countries you can point out. Singapore is actually quite an amazing story because it essentially has nothing. And it started out as a port to facilitate trade from Southeast Asia to the global economy. Then it expanded into a business services hub, and then very explicitly moved into becoming a regional financial center and has a lot of the Chinese offshore trading. That's an incredible story. But you can look around the world. There are many different stories of smaller countries. It's harder to move a big country like ours, but I think that the U.S. has benefited from the openness it has, and I agree. But I would say we lead the world in innovation and dynamism.
And the only thing I'll add to that is that, it's important, I think, when thinking about the innovation story, to also think about the IT sector, but also what's happening across economy broadly. I think GE probably thinks of itself part of the technology company now. So even areas where they might be traditionally manufacturing or even agriculture are doing really fascinating things, data and the internet, leveraging those possibilities to improve productivity in home and globally. When you look at Colombia, Vietnam's becoming a hub for data centers. The EU does amazing things on apps, and we've got some great IT companies. So I think it's happening globally, and I think the small, medium-sized enterprise opportunities there, but we sort of need to be talking about it more. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for their excellent